Old Samuel Morrison had crossed that rickety wooden bridge over Devil's Creek 1,000 times in his 40 years of farming, but on this particular morning in the autumn of 1887, his faithful mule Jeremiah planted his hooves firm in the dirt and refused to budge another inch. The stubborn animal's ears twitched nervously as he stared at the weathered planks spanning the 20-foot gorge, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an almost human-like terror that sent chills down Samuel's weathered spine. What started as another routine trip to the market in Cedar Falls, Wyoming territory, was about to uncover a secret that had been buried beneath those innocent-looking bridge supports for over 2 decades, a secret that would shake the very foundations of their small frontier community. Samuel clicked his tongue and tugged at Jeremiah's leather reins, but the mule remained as immovable as the granite peaks surrounding their isolated valley. This wasn't like Jeremiah at all. The reliable animal had carried Samuel and his late wife Martha across this same bridge through blizzards, floods, and the occasional Indian raid without so much as a hesitant step. The farmer dismounted from his wooden cart, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground as he approached his 4-legged companion. Jeremiah's dark eyes were wide with what could only be described as genuine fear, his nostrils flaring as if detecting some invisible threat that Samuel's human senses couldn't perceive. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like ghostly fingers, and Samuel found himself unconsciously lowering his voice as he spoke to his frightened animal. The bridge had been built by the town's founding fathers back in 1863, constructed from sturdy pine logs and reinforced with iron brackets that had somehow survived the harsh Wyoming winters. Local legend claimed that 3 men had died during its construction, their bodies supposedly buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, but Samuel had never paid much attention to such tales. He was a practical man, concerned with crop yields and livestock prices, not the superstitious stories that seemed to multiply like weeds in isolated frontier communities. As Samuel examined the bridge more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wooden planks near the center support beam appeared to be sagging slightly, creating an almost imperceptible depression that he had never noticed before. More disturbing still, there seemed to be a dark stain seeping up through the gaps between the boards, a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood despite the recent rains that should have washed away any surface discoloration. The morning sun, filtering through the canyon's rim, cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe beneath the bridge's weathered structure. Jeremiah snorted and backed away from the bridge, nearly overturning the cart filled with Samuel's harvest of winter squash and preserved meats intended for the Cedar Falls market. The mule's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, and Samuel began to wonder if perhaps the animal's keen senses were detecting something that his own limited human perception had missed. Animals, his grandfather had always told him, possessed an intuitive understanding of danger that civilized men had lost through generations of city living and book learning. Against his better judgment, Samuel decided to investigate the source of his mule's distress. He secured Jeremiah to a sturdy oak tree about 50 yards from the bridge and retrieved a coiled rope from his supply box, along with the kerosene lantern he kept for emergency repairs in his barn. The descent into the canyon beneath the bridge would be treacherous, but his curiosity had been piqued beyond the point of rational caution. If there was indeed something wrong with the bridge's structural integrity, it was his civic duty to report it to the town council before some unsuspecting traveler met with disaster. The rope held firm as Samuel lowered himself over the canyon's edge, his worn leather boots scraping against the rocky wall as he made his way toward the shadowy space beneath the bridge. The air grew noticeably colder as he descended, and an unpleasant odor began to assault his senses, a mixture of decay, stagnant water, and something else he couldn't quite identify. His lantern cast flickering shadows on the canyon walls, revealing ancient Native American petroglyphs that seemed to watch his progress with stone eyes that had witnessed centuries of human folly. What Samuel discovered in that damp, hidden space beneath the bridge would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Wedged between 2 massive support beams, partially concealed by decades of accumulated debris and rotting vegetation, were the skeletal remains of what appeared to be at least 3 human beings. The bones were still partially clothed in the deteriorating fabric of what might once have been fine Eastern clothing, certainly not the rough work clothes typical of local farmers or ranch hands. More disturbing still, The positioning of the remains suggested that these individuals had been placed there deliberately, their bodies arranged with an almost ritualistic precision that spoke of careful planning rather than accidental death. Samuel's hands trembled as he raised his lantern for a closer examination, and what he saw next nearly caused him to lose his grip on the rope entirely. Clutched in the bony fingers of the largest skeleton was a leather satchel, miraculously preserved by the dry canyon air and protected from the elements by the bridge's overhang. Inside that satchel, Samuel would later discover, were documents that would expose a conspiracy involving some of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens. Documents that detailed a scheme of land fraud, murder, and political corruption that stretched all the way to the territorial capital in Cheyenne. The first document Samuel examined by the wavering light of his lantern was a deed of sale dated October 15, 1865, transferring ownership of nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land from the Crow Indian Reservation to a consortium of investors led by Judge Cornelius Blackwood, the same man who currently served as Cedar Falls' most prominent civic leader and whose imposing Victorian mansion dominated the town's main street. The deed bore what appeared to be genuine signatures from tribal leaders, but Samuel's limited knowledge of such matters couldn't determine whether the document was legitimate or an elaborate forgery. More damning still was a series of letters written in Judge Blackwood's distinctive handwriting, correspondence that detailed payments made to territorial officials for their assistance in expediting land transfers and suppressing any investigations into the mysterious disappearances of federal land agents who had been sent to investigate reports of illegal settlements on reservation property. The letters spoke in coded language of permanent solutions to troublesome inquiries and made reference to a reliable method of disposal that ensured complete silence from potential witnesses. Samuel realized that he was holding evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple land fraud. These documents implicated Judge Blackwood and his associates in the systematic murder of federal officials who had threatened to expose their illegal activities. The three skeletons beneath the bridge were likely the remains of government agents who had arrived in Cedar Falls to investigate reports of unauthorized settlements, only to meet their deaths at the hands of the very men they had come to investigate. The implications of his discovery began to dawn on Samuel as he carefully returned the documents to their leather satchel and prepared to climb back to safety. Judge Blackwood wasn't just Cedar Falls' most respected citizen. He was also the man who controlled the territorial court system, the local law enforcement, and most of the town's business interests. Any attempt to expose his crimes would have to be handled with extreme caution, as Blackwood undoubtedly still possessed the power to eliminate anyone who threatened his carefully constructed facade of respectability. As Samuel hauled himself back up the canyon wall, his mind raced with the terrible knowledge he now possessed. The town he had called home for his entire adult life was built on a foundation of murder and corruption, ruled by a man who had killed federal agents and buried their bodies beneath the very bridge that connected Cedar Falls to the outside world. The symbolism wasn't lost on Samuel. Blackwood had literally buried the truth beneath the town's lifeline to civilization, ensuring that his crimes would remain hidden as long as people continued to cross that bridge without looking too closely at what lay beneath. Back on solid ground, Samuel found Jeremiah waiting patiently, no longer agitated now that his master had moved away from the cursed bridge. The mule's intuitive fear had been justified. Animals, it seemed, possessed an innate ability to sense the presence of unquiet spirits and violent death. Samuel loaded his rope and lantern back into the cart, but he couldn't bring himself to cross the bridge, not when he knew what secrets lay moldering in the darkness below. Instead, he guided Jeremiah along the longer route to Cedar Falls, a winding trail that added 3 hours to their journey but allowed him time to formulate a plan for exposing Judge Blackwood's crimes without getting himself killed in the process. The evidence he carried was explosive, but Samuel knew that presenting it to local authorities would be tantamount to signing his own death warrant. Blackwood's influence extended throughout the territory, and there were few men in positions of power who weren't either bought, intimidated, or complicit in maintaining the status quo that had served the judge's interests so well. Samuel's first instinct was to take the evidence directly to the federal authorities in Cheyenne, but he quickly realized that such a course of action would require him to travel through Cedar Falls, where Blackwood's network of informants would almost certainly learn of his intentions before he could reach safety. The judge had spent 20 years building his criminal empire, and he hadn't survived this long by being careless about potential threats to his operation. As Samuel's cart rattled along the rocky trail toward town, he began to formulate a different strategy, one that would require patience, cunning, and a considerable amount of courage. Rather than confronting Blackwood directly or attempting to flee with the evidence, Samuel decided to conduct his own investigation into the judge's criminal activities, gathering additional proof while maintaining the appearance of a simple farmer going about his normal business. The plan was risky, but Samuel felt a moral obligation to the three men whose bones lay beneath the bridge, federal agents who had died in the line of duty, while attempting to protect the rights of Native Americans and preserve the integrity of territorial law. Their deaths had gone unavenged for over 2 decades, their disappearances explained away as unfortunate encounters with hostile Indians or accidents in the unforgiving wilderness of the Wyoming Territory. Samuel's investigation began that very afternoon when he arrived in Cedar Falls and made his routine stops at the general store, the feed mill, and the bank where Judge Blackwood served as president and primary shareholder. The farmer paid careful attention to conversations, noting which names appeared frequently in discussions of business deals and land transactions, and began to piece together a picture of the judge's extensive network of associates and co-conspirators. What Samuel discovered over the following weeks was a criminal organization that extended far beyond simple land fraud, encompassing illegal mining operations, cattle rustling, tax evasion, and the systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned the judge's authority. Blackwood had essentially transformed Cedar Falls into his personal fiefdom, where his word was law and dissent was met with swift and permanent retribution. The judge's criminal empire was supported by a carefully selected group of associates who shared in the profits while remaining absolutely loyal to their leader. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a former Confederate soldier who had arrived in Wyoming Territory shortly after the Civil War, served as Blackwood's primary enforcer, using his badge and authority to eliminate threats and cover up evidence of the organization's illegal activities. Dr. Hamilton Pierce, the town's only physician, had been providing false death certificates and medical opinions that supported the official explanations for the disappearances of troublesome individuals. Mayor William Garrett, supposedly an elected representative of the people's interests, was actually nothing more than a puppet whose strings were pulled by Judge Blackwood's invisible hand. The mayor's primary function was to provide a democratic facade for what was essentially a criminal dictatorship, rubber-stamping Blackwood's decisions while maintaining the illusion that Cedar Falls was governed by legitimate political processes. Even Reverend Joshua Matthews, the Methodist minister who delivered weekly sermons about morality and Christian virtue, had been compromised by his knowledge of the judge's crimes and his acceptance of substantial donations to keep his church financially viable. The Reverend's silence had been purchased with gold coins and the implicit understanding that his own survival depended upon his continued cooperation with Blackwood's organization. As Samuel's secret investigation progressed, he began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had controlled Cedar Falls for more than 20 years. Every person in a position of authority had been either corrupted, intimidated, or eliminated, creating a closed system where opposition was impossible and justice was whatever Judge Blackwood declared it to be. The 3 federal agents whose bodies lay beneath the bridge had walked into a carefully prepared trap, their investigation doomed from the moment they announced their intentions to examine land records and interview local officials. Samuel realized that his own survival depended upon his ability to maintain the appearance of ignorance while secretly gathering evidence that could eventually be used to expose the entire criminal organization. He continued his normal routine of farming, marketing his crops, and participating in community activities, all while carefully documenting the judge's illegal activities and building a case that would be strong enough to convince federal authorities to take action against Blackwood's empire. The breakthrough in Samuel's investigation came when he discovered that Judge Blackwood was planning to eliminate another potential threat to his organization. A new federal land agent named Thomas Morrison had been assigned to investigate reports of unauthorized settlements on Indian reservation land, and Samuel learned through careful eavesdropping that the judge was preparing to arrange yet another accident that would permanently silence this latest threat to his criminal empire. Samuel faced a terrible dilemma. He could continue his careful investigation and hope to gather enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy, or he could attempt to warn Thomas Morrison and risk revealing his own knowledge of Blackwood's crimes. The moral choice was clear, but the practical consequences could be fatal for both Samuel and the unsuspecting federal agent who was walking into the same trap that had claimed his 3 predecessors. The decision was made for Samuel when he learned that Thomas Morrison was scheduled to arrive in Cedar Falls within the week, and that Judge Blackwood had already made arrangements with Sheriff Bradley to ensure that the federal agent would meet with an unfortunate accident during his investigation. Samuel couldn't stand by and watch another innocent man die, not when he possessed the knowledge and evidence that could prevent such a tragedy. Samuel's plan to save Thomas Morrison and expose Judge Blackwood's crimes required precise timing and considerable luck. He would have to contact the federal agent before he reached Cedar Falls, warn him of the danger he faced, and provide him with the evidence necessary to bring down Blackwood's entire criminal organization. The plan was fraught with risk, but Samuel felt that he had no choice but to act on his moral convictions, regardless of the personal consequences he might face. The confrontation between Samuel Morrison and Judge Blackwood's criminal empire would test every ounce of courage and cunning the simple farmer possessed, forcing him to match wits with men who had spent decades perfecting their methods of intimidation and murder. The stakes couldn't be higher. Failure would mean death not only for Samuel and Thomas Morrison, but also for any future federal agents who might be sent to investigate the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the Wyoming Territory for over 2 decades. As Samuel prepared for the most dangerous gambit of his life, he couldn't help but think about his faithful mule Jeremiah, whose instinctive fear of the bridge had led to the discovery that would either bring justice to Cedar Falls or result in Samuel's own bones joining those of the 3 federal agents in the darkness beneath the cursed span that connected his town to the outside world. The morning Thomas Morrison was scheduled to arrive in Cedar Falls, Samuel loaded his cart with what appeared to be routine supplies but actually contained copies of all the evidence he had gathered, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath sacks of grain. He had spent sleepless nights preparing multiple sets of documents, knowing that his survival might depend on having backup copies hidden in various locations around his farm. Jeremiah seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, his usual placid demeanor replaced by an alertness that reminded Samuel of soldiers he had known during his brief service in the Union Army. Samuel's plan required him to intercept Morrison before the federal agent reached Cedar Falls, but Judge Blackwood's network of informants made such a meeting extremely dangerous. The judge had already positioned Sheriff Bradley and several deputized ranch hands along the main roads leading into town, ostensibly to provide a proper welcome for the visiting federal official, but actually to ensure that Morrison would be under constant surveillance from the moment he entered Blackwood's territory. The breakthrough came when Samuel learned from loose-tongued conversation at the general store that Morrison would be stopping at the way station at Copper Creek, about 15 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, to rest his horses and resupply before continuing his journey. This remote outpost was operated by Jake Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Wyoming Territory only 2 years earlier and whose loyalty to Judge Blackwood was questionable at best. More importantly, Sullivan's station was located just outside the judge's immediate sphere of influence, providing Samuel with his best opportunity to make contact with Morrison without being observed by Blackwood's spies. Samuel set out before dawn, taking the longer route through the mountain passes to avoid the main roads where he might encounter the judge's men. The journey was treacherous, requiring him to navigate rocky trails that were barely wide enough for his cart. But Jeremiah proved once again why mules were considered the most reliable animals on the frontier. The sure-footed creature picked his way carefully along precipitous ledges and through dense pine forests, guided by some internal compass that never failed to find the safest path through even the most challenging terrain. When Samuel finally reached Copper Creek Way Station, he found Thomas Morrison exactly as he had hoped, a dedicated federal agent in his early 30s, traveling alone with minimal protection and completely unaware of the danger that awaited him in Cedar Falls. Morrison was examining a detailed map of the territory when Samuel approached, his earnest demeanor and careful attention to detail suggesting exactly the kind of thorough investigator who would pose a serious threat to Judge Blackwood's criminal empire. The conversation that followed would determine the fate of both men and potentially the entire town of Cedar Falls. Samuel had rehearsed his approach carefully, knowing that he would have only one chance to convince Morrison that his life was in danger and that the evidence Samuel carried was genuine. The federal agent listened with growing alarm as Samuel recounted his discovery beneath the bridge and presented the documents he had found with the skeletal remains of Morrison's 3 predecessors. Morrison's initial skepticism quickly gave way to horrified understanding as he examined the papers and recognized the official seals and signatures that confirmed their authenticity. The federal agent had been briefed on the disappearances of his colleagues, but the official reports had attributed their deaths to hostile Indians or accidents in the wilderness. The evidence Samuel presented painted a very different picture, revealing a systematic pattern of murder designed to protect a vast criminal conspiracy that extended throughout the territorial government. The two men spent the remainder of that afternoon planning their strategy for exposing Judge Blackwood's crimes while staying alive long enough to see justice done. Morrison had the authority to call for federal marshals and military support, but such assistance would take weeks to arrive from the nearest garrison in Colorado Territory. In the meantime, they would have to survive in a town controlled by men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill federal agents who threatened their operation. Morrison's plan was both bold and dangerous. Rather than fleeing with Samuel's evidence, he would proceed to Cedar Falls as scheduled, maintaining the pretense of a routine investigation while secretly gathering additional proof of Blackwood's crimes. Samuel would return to his farm and continue his normal activities, but would be ready to provide assistance when Morrison needed it. The federal agent carried a small mirror that could be used to send coded signals to Samuel's farm, allowing them to communicate without risking face-to-face meetings that might be observed by Blackwood's network. The plan began to unfold exactly as Morrison and Samuel had anticipated. The federal agent arrived in Cedar Falls to a carefully orchestrated welcome from Judge Blackwood and the town's other officials, all of whom expressed their eager cooperation with his investigation while secretly planning his demise. Morrison played his role perfectly, appearing to accept the official explanations for his predecessor's disappearances, while carefully documenting evidence of the conspiracy that had claimed their lives. For 3 days, Morrison conducted his investigation under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Bradley and his deputies, visiting the locations where the previous federal agents had supposedly met their fates and interviewing the witnesses who had provided statements supporting the official version of events. All the while, he was secretly photographing documents, making detailed notes, and preparing the comprehensive report that would bring down Judge Blackwood's criminal empire once and for all. The crisis came on Morrison's 4th day in Cedar Falls, when Judge Blackwood decided that the federal agent had seen enough and needed to be eliminated before he could report his findings to his superiors. Samuel received Morrison's mirror signal just after sunset, a series of flashes that indicated immediate danger and requested emergency assistance at the predetermined meeting point near Devil's Creek Bridge. Samuel arrived at the rendezvous to find Morrison wounded and barely conscious, having narrowly escaped an assassination attempt orchestrated by Sheriff Bradley and 2 of his most trusted deputies. The federal agent had been shot in the shoulder while fleeing from what was supposed to appear as a fatal encounter with cattle rustlers, but his military training and quick thinking had allowed him to evade his would-be killers and reach safety. With Morrison seriously wounded and Judge Blackwood's men actively searching for him, Samuel faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could attempt to spirit the federal agent away to safety, abandoning his home and farm forever, or he could make a final stand against the corrupt system that had terrorized Cedar Falls for more than 20 years. The evidence they had gathered was more than sufficient to convict Blackwood and his associates, but only if it could be delivered to honest federal authorities who were beyond the judge's reach. Samuel's choice was made easier when Morrison revealed that he had already managed to send a coded telegram to the territorial governor in Cheyenne, requesting immediate assistance and indicating that his life was in danger. Federal marshals and a company of cavalry were already en route to Cedar Falls, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. Samuel and Morrison would have to survive that long while hiding from Blackwood searchers and protecting the evidence that would finally bring justice to their isolated frontier community. The final confrontation took place at the very bridge where Samuel's investigation had begun. Beneath the weathered wooden planks were the bones of 3 murdered federal agents had waited more than 20 years for justice. Judge Blackwood arrived with Sheriff Bradley and a dozen armed men, confident that he could eliminate the last 2 witnesses to his crimes and continue his reign of terror indefinitely. But Samuel Morrison was no ordinary farmer, and his years of quiet observation had taught him more about strategy and tactics than Judge Blackwood realized. The battle that followed would become legend in Wyoming territory, a desperate fight between justice and corruption that raged from sunset until dawn, with the fate of an entire community hanging in the balance. When the federal marshals finally arrived in Cedar Falls, They found Judge Blackwood's criminal empire in ruins and the evidence they needed to prosecute the surviving conspirators scattered like autumn leaves across the blood-soaked planks of Devil's Creek Bridge. Samuel Morrison had paid the ultimate price for his courage, but his sacrifice had finally broken the chains of corruption that had bound Cedar Falls for more than 2 decades. The 3 federal agents whose bones had moldered beneath the bridge were finally given proper burial in the town cemetery. Their deaths at last acknowledged and their sacrifice honored by a grateful community that was finally free to govern itself according to law rather than the whims of a criminal dictator. And somewhere in the shadows of memory, the spirit of a faithful mule named Jeremiah seemed to nod in approval, his instinctive fear of that cursed bridge having started the chain of events that brought justice to the Wyoming Territory at last.